On the 19th of August, 1812, in the grey swell of the North Atlantic, a British frigate called the Guerriere fired a full broadside into an American ship at close range, and the American sailors watched something happen that none of them had ever seen. The heavy iron cannonballs, 18 pounds of solid shot each, struck the side of their ship and bounced off. They did not punch through. They did not splinter the hull into a killing cloud of wood. They hit that dark oak wall and rebounded into the sea, and one of the American gunners, half in disbelief, is said to have shouted, "Huzzah! Her sides are made of iron." They were not iron. They were wood. But they were a kind of wood so dense and so hard that a British officer said firing at her was like firing at a wall of solid rock. And that day the ship earned the name she has carried for more than 200 years. Old Ironsides. But this is not really a story about a battle. It is a story about the wood, and about the men who cut it, because the sides that turned those cannonballs were not made in Boston. They were made in the heat and the fever swamps of the Georgia Sea Islands, out of a tree called the live oak, by men whose names, most of them, no one bothered to write down. One name we do have is John Morgan, a Connecticut shipwright who went south in the summer of 1794 to get that timber and nearly died doing it. The other men, the ones who actually swung the axes into wood hard as iron, were enslaved African Americans, and the records of the time kept the name of the man who owned them and forgot the names of the men themselves. This is the story of how a brand new country, with almost no navy at all, built a warship that the most powerful fleet on earth could not break, and of the forgotten hands in a Georgia swamp that made it possible. If you care about the men who built this country with their hands, the workers nobody ever wrote a book about, please subscribe to Global Old History right now. Hit the button. Come back. Because the men in this story, the ones who mattered most, are exactly the ones history tried hardest to forget. To understand why this ship had to be so strong, you have to understand how weak the country was that built her. In the 1790s, the United States was barely a country at all. It had won its independence, but it had almost no navy, a handful of ships, and out on the oceans that left American merchant vessels defenseless. Barbary corsairs from the North African coast were seizing American ships and holding their crews for ransom or selling them into slavery. And behind that immediate insult loomed the two great naval powers of the age, Britain and France, either of which could sweep American shipping from the sea whenever it pleased. So in 1794, the young Congress did something it could barely afford. It passed the Naval Act, and it authorized the building of 6 frigates, and it set aside a little over $300,000 to do it, which in that era was an enormous sum for a nation deep in debt. 6 ships. That was the entire gamble. 6 ships were supposed to give a bankrupt young republic a voice on oceans ruled by fleets of hundreds. And everyone involved understood that if these 6 ships were going to matter at all, they could not be ordinary frigates. An ordinary American frigate would simply be caught and destroyed by a bigger British ship of the line, or would lose to an equal British frigate manned by the finest sailors in the world. The math did not work. 6 against hundreds is not a navy. So the men who designed these ships made a decision that changed everything. If they could not build many ships, they would build a few impossible ones. The designer was a Quaker shipbuilder from Philadelphia named Joshua Humphreys, and Humphreys had a radical idea. He would build frigates that were bigger, longer, and far stronger than anything else afloat in their class. They would carry more guns than a normal frigate, enough to overwhelm any enemy frigate they met. And they would be built so heavily, with such thick sides and such clever internal bracing, that they could take punishment that would sink a lighter ship. The idea was a warship that could beat anything small enough to fight and outrun anything big enough to beat it. That idea did not come easily, and it almost did not survive Congress. The whole reason for a navy in the first place was humiliation on the water. Pirates operating out of the Barbary states of North Africa, Algiers and Tripoli and Tunis were seizing American merchant ships, chaining their crews and demanding ransom or selling the sailors into slavery. A country that could not protect its own people at sea was not really a country, and the new nation's leaders knew it. But there was fierce disagreement about the answer. One side believed a navy was essential to national survival. The other side feared that building warships would be ruinously expensive and would drag the young republic into the endless wars of Europe. The compromise that finally passed in 1794 had a poison pill written into it. If peace could be made with Algiers, construction of the frigates would stop. And in 1796, a peace was indeed struck, and the whole program nearly died on the spot. It took another act of Congress and a hard political fight just to keep 3 of the 6 ships going, and the Constitution was one of the 3 that survived. So before a single frame was raised, this ship had already almost been canceled twice. The man whose vision kept the idea alive was Joshua Humphreys, and it is worth understanding just how radical his design was. In that era, warships came in rough classes. There were massive ships of the line, floating gun platforms too slow to catch a frigate. And there were frigates, faster ships that scouted and raided and fought each other. Humphreys designed something that did not quite fit either box. A frigate so large and so heavily built that it blurred the line, longer on the keel than any frigate afloat, carrying a heavier main battery of long 24-pounder guns where rival frigates carried 18s. The reasoning was cold and brilliant. Against any frigate, his ships would have more guns, heavier guns, and a stronger hull, and would win. Against any ship of the line big enough to beat them, they would be faster and would escape. The Constitution was one of a family of 6 sisters, ships with names like the United States, the President, the Constellation, the Congress, and the ill-fated Chesapeake. Together they were the whole Navy, and each one was a bet that quality could stand in for quantity, with the survival of American trade riding on it. To do that, Humphreys needed a hull that was practically a floating fortress, and for that he needed a wood that almost no other navy in the world could get its hands on. He needed live oak. Now, I want to tell you about this tree, because everything turns on it, and most people have never heard of it. The southern live oak is not like the tall, straight oaks of the northern forests. It is a low, sprawling, massive tree that grows along the coasts of the deep south, in Georgia and the Carolinas and Florida, draped in Spanish moss, its huge limbs twisting out sideways and curving down toward the ground. And its wood is extraordinary. Live oak is one of the densest woods that grows in North America. A cubic foot of it can weigh as much as 75 pounds, so heavy that a freshly cut piece of it will barely float, and so hard that the axeman who cut it said it was like chopping into iron. It resists rot. It resists the salt sea air that eats ordinary timber. And here is the part that made it priceless to a shipbuilder like Humphreys. Because the great limbs of the live oak grow in natural curves and angles, a shipwright could find, in a single tree, a piece already shaped like the curved rib of a ship, or the sharp elbow where 2 timbers had to meet. Instead of forcing straight wood into a curve and creating a weak point, he could cut a frame that was already curved, with the grain of the wood following the curve, giving it enormous natural strength. Live oak frames were the closest thing the age of sail had to steel. And here is why that mattered so much beyond the shipyard. The great naval powers of Europe were running short of good shipbuilding timber. Britain in particular had been cutting its home oak forests for centuries to feed the Royal Navy, and it leaned heavily on imported wood from the Baltic and its colonies. Live oak, this uniquely dense and durable American tree, grew almost nowhere else in the world in usable quantity. It was, in effect, a strategic resource the United States held and its rivals did not. A hull framed in live oak would outlast one framed in ordinary European oak by decades, and would shrug off punishment that would open a lighter ship to the sea. But that advantage had to be paid for in human suffering, because the wood was almost impossible to handle. Live oak was so heavy that a green log would barely float, which made it a nightmare to drag out of the swamps and load aboard ship. It was so hard that it dulled and shattered the axes of the men cutting it. And it grew, inconveniently for everyone, in exactly the most disease-ridden corner of the young country. The Navy would spend years and lives learning that owning the best shipbuilding timber in the world meant very little if you could not keep men alive long enough to cut it. Quick pause. If these stories matter to you, join the Boss tier for $4.99 a month. Loyalty badge, custom emoji, early access 24 hours before public, and members-only polls. Link in the description. Now back to it. But there was a catch, and the catch is the human heart of this whole story. Live oak grows only in the coastal south, and in the 1790s that coast was a wild, hot, malarial frontier of swamps and sea islands. Getting the timber meant sending men into some of the most dangerous country in America to cut the hardest wood on the continent by hand and hauling it out of the mud and shipping it up to the northern yards, The Navy chose a place called Gascoigne Bluff on St. Simon's Island, off the Georgia coast, where great stands of live oak grew. And in August of 1794, they sent a Connecticut shipwright named John Morgan south to supervise the cutting. Morgan brought with him a crew of New England woodcutters, skilled northern axemen, and the plan was that these experienced men would go into the Georgia woods and cut the frames for the frigates. It was a disaster. The men from the cold north had no defense against the diseases of the southern coast. The sea islands in summer were thick with mosquitoes and the fevers they carried, malaria and worse, and the northern axemen began to sicken and die. After several months in that country, many of Morgan's men were dead, and most of the rest had deserted, fleeing the swamps and the fever and the impossible labor. I have tried to picture those camps because the records give just enough to make them real and not enough to make them bearable. The men worked in a wet, low country of tidal creeks and marsh, where the summer heat was crushing and the air was thick with mosquitoes and biting sandflies. There was no real shelter, little clean water, and no medicine that could touch the fevers that rose with the season. Malaria was not understood then. The men only knew that in the hot months, a killing sickness came out of the marshes, and that northern men in particular seemed to have no resistance to it at all. Morgan watched his skilled Connecticut axemen, men he had brought 1,000 miles for their expertise, sicken and die or slip away into the night rather than stay and die. And into that gap the contractors pushed enslaved men, because enslaved men could not desert and could not refuse. They were made to clear the razor-edge saw palmetto by hand, to fell the iron-hard trees, and to shape the frames to precise curved patterns sent down from the shipyards, all in the same fevered ground that had emptied the northern camps. It was some of the hardest and most dangerous labor in the entire country, performed for no wage, by men whose skill with an axe and an adze was real and considerable and entirely uncredited. And then the timber had to travel. The finished frames and the great raw timbers were dragged to the water and loaded aboard ships for the long coastal voyage north to the building yards. Even that was slow and costly, and storms and delays and the sheer weight of the wood made it a constant struggle. Years went by between the first cutting on St. Simon's Island and the finished frigates riding in northern harbors. Every rib of the Constitution stands for not just a felled tree, but a chain of labor and suffering that ran from a Georgia swamp onto a ship, up the coast, and into a Boston shipyard. And almost every link in that chain except the last was made of hands the record did not name. The great plan to cut the Navy's timber with free northern labor had collapsed into graves and empty camps. When a Navy captain came down to check on the work and to ship the timber north, he found that almost nothing had been done. And so the Navy turned to the labor it could not lose to desertion, because that labor was not free to leave. It turned to slavery. Morgan and the contractors hired enslaved African-American men from the local plantation owners, men like a landowner named Richard Leake, whose people were put to the work the northern axemen had died and fled from. And it was these enslaved men who actually cut the live oak that became the sides of the United States Navy's first warships. Think about what that work was. First, they had to clear a dense, thorny underbrush of saw palmetto just to reach the trees. Then they had to fell and shape live oak, wood described in the records as hard as iron, in swampy, hot, disease-ridden ground, in the same fevered country that had killed the northern men. And the cutting was not simple felling. It had to be precise, because the whole value of live oak was in those natural curves. And a frame had to be cut to follow the shape of a branch exactly, so it would fit the pattern of the ship. This was skilled, brutal, dangerous work, done under the worst conditions America had to offer, by men who were never paid, whose skill was stolen along with their labor, and whose names, almost without exception, were never written down. I keep coming back to that asymmetry in the record, because it is the whole thing in miniature. We know the name of Richard Leake, the man who owned the workers. We know the name of John Morgan, the man who supervised them. We do not know the names of the men who actually cut the iron-hard oak that saved American sailors' lives 30 years later. The ship became famous. The men who made her strong became invisible. And here is a fact that historians at the ship's own museum will tell you today. Because live oak lasts so long, it is quite likely that some of the very timbers those enslaved men cut in the 1790s are still in the hull of the ship right now, still floating, still holding, more than 2 centuries later. Their work outlived them by lifetimes, and it never carried their names. The timber that survived the swamps was loaded onto ships and sent north, and this is where the second half of the labor begins, in the shipyards of Boston. The frigate that would become the Constitution was built at a yard owned by a man named Edmund Hart in the north end of Boston, on the water. The master builder in charge was a shipwright named George Claghorn, and under him worked a whole community of tradesmen, including a foreman named Prince Athiarn, and the shipwrights and caulkers and joiners and riggers and laborers who would turn a pile of Georgia timber and northern pine into a warship. A shipyard in the 1790s was not a single trade. It was a whole industrial town gathered around one hull, and building the Constitution set hundreds of people to work in dozens of crafts. There were the shipwrights, the master craftsmen who read the designer's drafts and shaped and joined the great timbers into the skeleton and skin of the ship. There were the sawyers, who cut the timber to size, one man standing above and one down in a pit below, dragging a great saw up and down through the wood by hand, the man in the pit half blind with falling sawdust. There were the caulkers, who drove tarred fibers of oakum into every seam between the planks with mallets and irons, and then sealed them with hot pitch, because a single badly caulked seam could sink a ship, and a warship's hull held miles of seams. There were blacksmiths forging the fittings, blockmakers turning out the wooden pulleys, joiners fitting the cabins, painters and laborers hauling and lifting from dawn to dark. And beyond the yard, the ship reached out into the whole city. In the rope walks, long narrow buildings, sometimes a quarter-mile in length, workers walked slowly backward, spinning hemp into the miles of cordage a full-rigged ship required. In the sail lofts, sailmakers stitched acres of heavy canvas by hand into the sails that would drive her. A ship like this was the single most complex machine a society of that era could build, and it pulled the labor of an entire port into one purpose. When you look at the finished Constitution and see a warship, you should really be seeing the sawyer in his pit, the caulker on his plank, the rope maker walking backward in the long shed, and the enslaved man in the Georgia marsh, all of them present in the timber and the rigging, and almost all of them nameless now. Before I tell you how they built her, do me a favor and subscribe. The algorithm buries old industry stories unless enough people click. One click. Come back. Because the way they assembled this hull is the reason the Cannonballs bounced, and it is a piece of engineering that deserves to be understood, not just admired. Here is how you build a side that stops a cannonball with wood. You do it in layers, and you do it thick. The frames, the ribs of the ship, were those curved live oak timbers from Georgia, and Humphreys had them set close together, much closer than in an ordinary ship, so that the skeleton itself was almost a solid wall of the hardest wood in America. Then, over the outside of those frames went a thick skin of oak planking, and on the inside went another thick layer of planking, so that at the waterline, where an enemy would aim, the total thickness of the ship's side, outer planking and live oak frame and inner planking together came to something close to 2 feet of solid oak. 2 feet? An 18-pound iron ball fired from a few hundred yards away simply did not carry enough force to drive through 2 feet of layered oak with a core of live oak as hard as iron. It struck, it crushed a little of the surface, and it bounced. But thickness alone was not Humphrey's real genius. A ship this long had another enemy, and that enemy was its own weight. A long wooden hull, heavy at the ends and floating in water that lifts it unevenly, tends over time to sag in the middle or droop at the bow and stern, a slow structural failure the shipwrights called hogging. To fight it, Humphreys ran a set of massive diagonal braces, called riders, up the inside of the hull at an angle, like the diagonal boards that keep a gate from sagging on its hinges. These diagonal riders tied the whole long hull together into one rigid structure and kept it from working itself apart in heavy seas. It was a level of internal strength that ordinary frigates simply did not have, and it is a large part of why this ship is still afloat today when every one of her British contemporaries is long gone. Then there was the fastening, the thousands of bolts and spikes and fittings that held all that timber together, and much of that copper and bronze work came from a name every American knows for another reason entirely. Paul Revere, the same Boston silversmith who had ridden to warn of the British in 1775, had a foundry, and he supplied copper fittings and spikes for the ship, and years later, in 1803, He would roll the copper sheathing that protected her hull below the waterline. The Midnight Rider became the Navy's coppersmith. Even the fastenings of this ship carry a piece of the Revolution in them. But before any of that timber could be shaped, the builders had to solve a puzzle of pure geometry, and they solved it the way shipwrights had for centuries, on the floor of a great room called the mold loft. There, working at full size on a vast, smooth floor, they drew out the exact curves of every frame in the ship from the designer's small-scale plans, and from those full-size drawings they cut thin wooden patterns called molds for each piece. Only then could the sawyers and shipwrights take a curved, live oak timber and cut it to match its mold exactly, so that when all the pieces came together, they formed the precise shape Humphreys had drawn on paper. Each great rib of the ship was not one piece but several overlapping timbers, called futtocks, joined and bolted so that the joints in one layer were covered by the solid wood of the next, giving the frame strength all the way around its curve. The whole skeleton was fastened together with a mix of wooden pegs, called tree nails, driven into bored holes so they swelled tight when wet, and with thousands of copper and iron bolts and spikes, many of them from Revere's foundry. Wood fastened with iron alone would have rusted and rotted itself apart in salt water, so the choice of copper below the waterline was not decoration. It was survival. And over the outside of the finished hull, below the waterline, went a skin of copper sheathing, thin sheets of copper nailed over the planking. That copper was not armor against cannon. It was armor against the sea itself, against the shipworm that bored into unprotected hulls and the weed and barnacles that fouled them and dragged them slow. A copper-bottomed ship stayed faster and lasted far longer, and Paul Revere, in time, would roll the very sheets that clad her. Now think of the sheer quantity of it. Miles of planking, hundreds of massive frames, tens of thousands of fastenings, every one driven by hand, acres of copper, every piece of it shaped and fitted and hammered home by a workman with a tool in his fist, one bolt, one plank, one seam at a time, until a pile of swamp, timber, and northern pine had become a single ship strong enough to laugh at cannon fire. That is what the word built really means here. Not assembled by a machine. Made, by hand, by hundreds of men, over years. And the raw material this swallowed is hard to picture. The wood for a single one of these frigates came from something like 60 acres of forest, and the live oak alone for the whole class of 6 ships meant felling on the order of 2,000 of those slow-growing coastal trees. This was not lumber you could order and use the next week. Green timber had to be seasoned, left to dry, so it would not warp and split once it was worked into a ship, and live oak was so dense that it gave up its moisture slowly and grudgingly. Between the cutting in Georgia, the shipping north, the seasoning, the lofting, and the shaping, years slipped by. The keel of the Constitution was laid in the autumn of 1794, and she did not touch the water until the autumn of 1797, 3 full years later, and even that felt slow to the people waiting on her. There is a kind of patience in that which we have almost entirely lost. These men were building out of a material that could not be hurried, using methods that could not be hurried, and they accepted it. They cut and shipped and stacked and weighted and shaped, and only then did they build. The ship that seems to appear so suddenly in the history books, winning her famous battle in half an hour, was, in truth, the slow accumulation of years of quiet labor by people who, in many cases, never lived to see how the story ended. All of this took time and money, and the work dragged on far longer than anyone had planned. The live oak troubles in Georgia caused delays. Politics caused delays, as a brief peace made some in Congress wonder whether the ships were needed at all. Costs ran over. But slowly, on the ways at Hart's Yard, the shape of something unprecedented rose over the Boston waterfront, a frigate longer and heavier than any other in her class in the world. One quick note. I turned the full story into a book, everything the records gave me. If you want it, the link is in the description. And then came the day she was supposed to touch the water, and the ship refused to go. On the 20th of September, 1797, with a crowd gathered to watch, they knocked away the supports to let her slide down the launching ways into the harbor, and she moved about 27 feet and stopped. The ways had settled under her enormous weight. 2 days later, they tried again, and she slid another 31 feet and stopped again. The heaviest frigate anyone had ever built was too heavy for her own launch. It took weeks of work, rebuilding the ways to a steeper and stronger slope before they could try a third time. That second failure was a public humiliation. Launches were great civic events in those days, with crowds lining the shore, dignitaries in attendance, and the whole city watching the new warship take the water. And twice now, the most expensive and ambitious ship the country had ever built had lurched partway down the ways and stuck fast, like a beached whale, in front of everyone. George Claghorn, the master builder, had to face the plain fact that the sheer weight of his live oak framed hull, the very thing that made her strong, was more than the launching ways could bear, and that the ground beneath them had settled under the load. There was no quick fix. His men had to tear out and rebuild the ways at a steeper angle and on firmer footing, work that took weeks, all while the half-launched ship sat there as a monument to the problem. It is a small thing next to a battle, but I find it human and telling. Even the launch of this ship, before she ever fired a gun, was a fight against her own tremendous weight, and it had to be won by ordinary workmen rebuilding a ramp by hand until the thing they had made would finally consent to float. And on the 21st of October, 1797, they knocked her loose once more, and this time the great hull ran down the ways and slid out onto the water of Boston Harbor and floated, and the ship that would be called the Constitution was finally, truly afloat. She was a little over 175 feet long on the deck, more than 43 feet across at her widest, and she displaced around 2,200 tons. She was rated as a 44-gun frigate, though in practice she often carried more than 50 guns, a mix of long 24-pounders that could reach out at a distance, and short heavy carronades that could smash an enemy up close. Her crew ran to around 450 men and boys, including a detachment of Marines and a number of boys as young as their early teens, the powder boys who carried charges to the guns in battle. She was, for her moment, one of the most powerful frigates in the world, and she had cost a young country a fortune it did not really have. But a bare hull floating in the harbor is not yet a warship. What came next was months more of labor to turn her into something that could fight. Great masts had to be stepped, the tallest rising well over 100 feet above the deck, each one a carefully shaped tree in its own right. The riggers came aboard and set up the standing rigging, the fixed ropes of tarred hemp that brace the masts, and then the running rigging, the moving lines that control the sails, until she carried miles of cordage, every foot of it spun by hand in the rope walks and hauled into place. Sails were bent onto the yards, acres of heavy canvas. Tons of iron and stone ballast were lowered into the bottom of the hull to hold her upright under her towering masts. The guns came aboard, each long 24-pounder weighing thousands of pounds, wrestled into place with block and tackle and muscle. Powder and shot and water and salt provisions were struck down into the hold. And then she needed men, around 450 of them, to sail her and fight her. That crew was its own small world, from the officers down through the skilled able seamen, the ordinary sailors, the Marines who would fight from the decks and the tops, and the boys, some barely into their teens, who would carry gunpowder from the magazine to the guns in the heat of battle. Every one of those jobs was hard, and many were dangerous, even in peacetime, because working a full-rigged ship meant men climbing 100 feet up, swaying rigging in every kind of weather to fight heavy wet canvas. The Constitution that finally put to sea was the product of thousands of hands, the swamp cutters and the shipwrights and the riggers and the rope makers, and then she was handed to hundreds more, the sailors who would live in her and, some of them, die in her. She was never the work of one man. She was the work of a whole country's worth of labor, most of it anonymous, poured into a single hull. For years, she did the ordinary hard work of a warship. She sailed against the Barbary corsairs in the Mediterranean, showing the flag of a country that finally had teeth at sea. But the moment that would make her immortal came in the summer of 1812, when the United States, in a decision many thought was madness, went to war with Great Britain, the greatest naval power on earth, a nation with hundreds of warships to America's handful. The British were contemptuous. They called the American frigates a few fur-built ships with bits of striped bunting, and they fully expected to sweep them from the sea. And they very nearly caught the Constitution right at the start. In July of 1812, off the American coast, she was spotted by a British squadron, several warships, and the wind died to almost nothing, leaving all of them nearly motionless on a glassy sea. What followed was one of the most extraordinary feats of seamanship in the age of sail, and it was done entirely by muscle. Her captain, Isaac Hull, ordered his men to lower the ship's boats, row small anchors far out ahead of the ship, drop them, and then have the crew haul on the anchor cables to drag the enormous frigate forward, foot by foot, across the flat water. It is called kedging. For something like 2 days and 2 nights, in the July heat, the crew of the Constitution rowed anchors ahead and hauled their ship along by main strength, gaining slowly on the pursuing British, who were trying the same desperate trick, until at last a breeze came up and she pulled away and escaped. The ship that would be famous for being unbreakable first became famous for being uncatchable, saved not by her guns, but by the exhausted arms of her own men. That chase deserves more than a mention, because it is one of the purest examples I know of a ship saved by raw human labor rather than by wind or gun. For something close to 2.5 days, in the dead heat of a windless July, the crews of the Constitution and her British pursuers fought a battle in slow motion, using no cannon at all. The Americans lowered their boats, rowed a small anchor as far ahead as the cable would reach, dropped it to the bottom, and then the whole crew heaved on the line to drag the enormous frigate up to the anchor, foot by foot, before rowing the anchor out ahead again. It is called kedging, and it is brutal, endless work. They wetted the sails with water hauled up in buckets to catch even the faintest breath of air. They pumped the ship out to lighten her. Men collapsed and were replaced and came back and heaved again. The British warships tried the very same trick, and for hours the distance between hunter and hunted opened and closed by mere yards, decided entirely by which crew could haul harder and longer in the heat. And the American crew won that contest of pure endurance, gaining slowly, until at last a wind returned and filled the sails, and the Constitution drew away and escaped a squadron that should have destroyed her. She was saved at the very start of her most famous war, not by the guns Humphreys gave her, but by the backs and arms of 400 exhausted men. Which brings us back to where we started, to the 19th of August, 1812. And the moment the cannonballs bounced, the Constitution, still under Isaac Hull, met the British frigate Guerrière alone on the open Atlantic. The Guerrière was a proud ship with a veteran crew, and her captain was so confident he practically invited the fight. The two ships closed, and the Guerrière opened fire first, at long range, and this is when the American sailors saw the impossible. British shots striking their hull and rebounding into the sea. Hull held his fire, closed the distance, and then unleashed his heavier broadsides at deadly close range. In about 30 minutes of savage fighting, the Constitution shot the masts clean out of the Guerrière, one after another, until the British ship was a dismasted, rolling wreck, unable to steer or fight, and she struck her colors and surrendered. Let me slow down on those 30 minutes, because they are the reason the ship is remembered. The two frigates came together in the late afternoon on a heavy sea. The British captain James Dacres was so sure of victory that he had reportedly wagered on it. The Guerrière opened fire at long range, and Isaac Hull, the American captain, held his own fire and kept closing, absorbing broadside after broadside, waiting. It was during that slow approach that his men, crouched at their guns, saw the enemy's shot striking home and rebounding from the hull, and raised the cry that named the ship. When Hull finally gave the order to fire, at pistol-shot range, his heavier guns tore into the Guerrière with terrible effect. Within minutes, one of the British ship's masts cracked and went over the side, dragging a chaos of rigging into the sea and pulling her around so she could not aim her guns. The two hulls came together, the Guerrière's bowsprit fouling in the Constitution's rigging, and for a few furious minutes men fired muskets across the gap and prepared to board through the smoke and the rolling swell. Then the ships tore apart, and the rest of the Guerrière's masts came crashing down until she lay a dismasted, helpless wreck, rolling her gun ports under the water. She had been beaten so thoroughly and her hull so shattered that when Dacres surrendered, the Americans found she was sinking and could not be saved. They took the survivors off through the night and set her afire, and at dawn she blew up. The whole action, from the first close broadside to the surrender, had taken about half an hour. In that half hour, a wooden ship, framed by enslaved men in a Georgia swamp and built by the tradesmen of Boston, had beaten a frigate of the most powerful navy on earth so completely that there was nothing left to tow home. The cost tells the whole story of the two ships. On the Guerriere, 13 men were dead, and more than 60 were wounded, and the ship herself was so shattered that the Americans could not even save her as a prize. They took off the survivors and blew her up. On the Constitution, 7 men had been killed and 7 wounded, and her hull was so little damaged that she sailed home in triumph. A wooden ship had just defeated a frigate of the Royal Navy in single combat, decisively, and the shock of it went around the world. It is hard, now, to feel how much that single victory meant. So let me set the scene around it. The War of 1812 was, for the United States, going badly almost everywhere else. On land, American armies were being beaten, and whole forts were being surrendered, and the invasion of Canada had collapsed into humiliation. The British Navy was beginning to clamp down a blockade that would eventually strangle the country's trade. Into all that gloom came the news of the Constitution and the Guerriere, and it landed like a single light in a dark room. Here, at least, was a victory. And not just any victory, but an American ship beating a ship of the Royal Navy in a fair fight, 1 against 1, the very thing everyone had been told was impossible. The Royal Navy had not lost a frigate duel like that in living memory. The British press, which had sneered at the Americans as a handful of fur-built frigates crewed by amateurs, was stunned and then furious. The American public, starved for good news, seized on the victory and would not let it go. And then, over the following months, the other American frigates began to win their own duels. And the Constitution herself won again. And what had looked like a fluke began to look like a pattern, a proof that the strange, oversized frigates a bankrupt Congress had almost canceled twice were the finest ships of their kind in the world. A country that had been humiliated at sea by pirates only 20 years before had built, out of swamp oak and stubbornness, warships the masters of the ocean could not beat. That is part of what those 7 dead men on the Constitution's deck bought, and it is a large part of why the country would refuse, years later, to let her be broken up for scrap. The British public could not believe it. The American public was electrified. And the ship had a new name that the sailors themselves had given her in the heat of it. Her sides are made of iron. Old Ironside. I have stood on her deck, because unlike almost every other wooden warship of her age, she is still here. The Constitution is still afloat today in the water at Charlestown. In Boston, the oldest commissioned warship in the world still afloat, and you can walk her decks and put your hand on her rail. That she survived at all is its own small miracle, because by 1830, the Navy considered her old and worn out, and there was talk of breaking her up for scrap. What saved her was not an admiral. It was a poem. A young writer named Oliver Wendell Holmes, hearing that they meant to destroy her, wrote a furious, grieving poem called Old Ironsides, and it was printed in the newspapers, and it swept the country, and the public outcry was so great that the Navy backed down and the ship was saved. I tear her tattered ensign down, the poem begins, and long has it waved on high. The people would not let her go. And Guerriere was not the end of it. Later in that same war, the Constitution fought again and won again, taking the British frigate Java in a long and bloody duel off the coast of Brazil, and near the end of the war, capturing 2 British warships, the Cyane and the Levant, in a single night action. Ship after ship, she proved that the first victory had been no fluke, that Humphreys had been right, that a few impossible frigates really could stand against a great fleet. By the time the guns fell silent, she was a national symbol, and that is exactly why the threat to scrap her in 1830 struck such a nerve, and why one young man's poem could move a whole country to save her. She has been rebuilt and repaired many times over the centuries since, so that today she is a patchwork of old wood and new, the way any living wooden ship must be. But down in her structure, timbers still remain from the earliest years, and that is where the story closes back on itself. The museum that cares for her now does not hide the hardest part of her history. It says plainly that the live oak which made her sides strong was cut by enslaved people, and that some of that very wood is almost certainly still in the ship. So the oldest commissioned warship afloat in the world, a beloved symbol of American liberty, floats in part on timber cut by men who had no liberty at all, and whose names were never written down. Both of those things are true at once, and the ship is more honest and more moving when you hold them together. When I walk her deck now, I think about the layers of hands in that dark oak beneath my feet. The enslaved men in the Georgia swamps who cut the iron-hard live oak and whose names were never written. John Morgan, who went south with a crew of free northern axemen and watched most of them die of fever or run. The shipwrights and caulkers in Edmund Hart's Boston Yard, men like the foreman Prince Athern, who fit those curved frames together into a wall that stopped cannon fire. The sailors who hauled her forward by anchor and rope across a windless sea to save her, and the 7 who died the day she earned her name. The ship is a monument, and we honor her, and we should. But a monument is only the top layer of something. Underneath this one, holding it up, quite literally forming the sides that turned the cannonballs, is the stolen labor of men in a fever swamp who never saw Boston, never saw the battle, and never had their names recorded. Their oak is still down there in the hull. When I put my hand on that old wood, I am touching their work. It is the one thing the sea and the cannon and 2 long centuries could not take back from them after almost everything else had already been taken. And I try, at least, to remember that it was theirs. One more thing. If you want to be part of the inner circle on this channel, join Final Boss for $9.99 a month. Public shout-out in upcoming videos, members-only investigations, plus everything from Boss tier. Link in description. See you in the next one.